the Honorable Marigold Harding, Chairman of the Edna Manley College of the Visual and Performing Arts, Board of Management, Dr. Trudy Ann Barrett, Acting Vice Principal, Miss Kerry Ann Henry, Acting Vice Principal of Administration and Resource Development, and Mr. Roger Williams, Acting Vice Principal of Academic Affairs, Dr. Amina Blackwood Meeks, College Orator, Dr. Dhanaraj Thakur, our keynote speaker, colleagues, members of the College Board of Management, students, friends of the college community, specially invited guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 12th Gender and Development Lecture. The Gender and Development Lecture over the years has interrogated issues incorporating feminist studies, social inequalities, masculinities, digital relationships, and gender studies, and as such has provided an ideal intellectual space in which to welcome a discourse on the topic we're still scrolling and searching, gender, technology, and the power in Caribbean. This evening, we are honored to welcome Dr. Dhanaraj Thakur, Research Director for the Center for Democracy and Technology in the United States of America, as our keynote speaker. He will unwrap the mystique involved in the complications that may be incorporated in technology and gender in the Caribbean, and those which emerge from the concept of power. As I reflect on tonight's topic, I cannot but think that central and certainly inescapable to the examination of a topic on gender, technology, and power in the Caribbean is a system involving notions of patriarchy, power, and sexual relations. A gender system comprises a network of power relations with two principal dimensions, one ideological and the other material. For Caribbean feminist and scholar Eudine Baritow, the ideological dimension is concerned with the construction of masculinities and femininities, while the material dimension exposes how women and men gain access to or are reallocated power, status, and material and non-material resources within a state and society. Baritow's ideological dimension of gender is not only related to the material, but also the non-material characteristics of gender relations. These paradigms reflect a clear interdependent relationships between ideology and resources of a social system on one hand, and sex stratification and status based on differential access to material and non-material rewards on the other. A prime example in this discourse of technology in the Caribbean would be the expectation that men are associated with technology. With this assumption in mind, a correlation could be made to the quality of material and non-material resources which are afforded. The definition of gender systems and gender ideologies, therefore, is nebulous and varying, and this is reflected in the further definitions and agreement on masculinities and femininities. Discussions about ascribing attributes of human beings based on gender, therefore, have to consider the fact that the Jamaican society organizes around patriarchal norms and ideologies, whereby the predominance of males in all power positions within the economy and society, as well as the gendering of those institutions themselves, by which the criteria for promotion, for example, appear to be gender neutral, but actually reproduce the gender order, and whereby the emotional and family arrangements in a society and the ways in which men's power in the public arena is reproduced at the level of private life. Men are expected to exert control, authority, and power over everyone in all situations. Women are objects to be controlled and are expected to support the needs of men. This suggests an unequal dichotomy between men and women, whereby men and their masculinities are prized over women and their femininity. I am sure that Dr. Thakur's lecture will allow us to reflect not only on gender, technology, and power in the Caribbean, but will also guide us in understanding the complications that need to be carefully deconstructed, negotiated, and resolved if gender justice is to be achieved. With these few opening remarks, I invite Dr. Trudy Ann Barrett, acting principal, to bring her greetings, after which Dr. Amina Blackwood Meeks, college orator, will introduce the keynote speaker.
Dr. Kina Senior, Chair of the Gender and Development Lecture, Chairman and other members of the Board of Management, Vice Principal of Administration and Resource Development, Ms. Kerry-Ann Henry, Acting Vice Principal of Academic Affairs, Mr. Roger Williams, our distinguished guest speaker, Dr. Dhanaraj Thakur, Dr. Blackwood Meeks, college orator, other specially invited guests, faculty, staff, and students of the Edna Manley College of the Visual and Performing Arts, a very good evening to you. It is my pleasure to bring you greetings at this, the 12th staging of our annual Gender and Development Lecture, which is intended to stimulate critical dialogue on contemporary issues that are at the intersection of arts and gender development. Themed, we're still scrolling and searching, gender, technology, and power in the Caribbean, the proceedings provide a timely opportunity to examine those liminal spaces that open up through that search, and in so doing, helps us to unpack the bearing that these dynamics have on our contemporary realities in the Caribbean. I'm confident, therefore, that the proceedings will honor the echoes that have defined us as a people and inspire and provoke critical thought on how the emergent nuances from the intersection of gender, technology, and the arts empowers us to address the ways that gender development may be effectively navigated to advance human rights and thereby enhance our praxis in this current dispensation. Welcome again, and thank you for sharing in this most important initiative.
And here I am, scrolling and searching. And what do you think I found? I found a 2006 song by Taurus Riley. In this new age Babylon culture, don't worship technology and bow to computer. And I also found by Bob Marley, his 1979 Survivors. In this age of technological inhumanity, scientific atrocity, atomic misphilosophy, nuclear misenergy, it's a world that forces lifelong insecurity. From Marley to Riley, and a host of reggae artists in between, including Chronix and the fireman himself, Capleton. Reggae musicians have consistently blazed a fire sounded warnings about the dangers of the internet and information technology. These have been met with varying degrees of ridicule and exasperation, perhaps because we have been conditioned to respond to our own with skepticism. And yet it seems more and more that the clairvoyance of our singers vis-a-vis the dangers of the information technology becomes less of a philosophical position to be scoffed at in favor of the need for policies for the protection of cyber citizens. The Center for Democracy and Technology is on a mission to strengthen individual rights and freedoms by defining, promoting, and influencing technology policy and the architecture of the internet. As research director at the center, Dr. Dhanaraj Thakur is on a mission to design research projects on ICT policy and regulation. Some of the subjects that have commanded the attention of our presenter has resulted in his work being quoted in several news media, including CNBC Africa, CNN, the Wall Street Journal, The Economist, The Guardian, the Financial Times, and the Interpress Service. In addition, he has published over 35 peer-reviewed journal articles, book chapters, and conference papers. We know that our presenter previously held political science faculty positions at Tennessee State University and the University of the West Indies Mona campus. He was also a research fellow at the Institute for Gender and Development Studies, UWI Mona. But what does an Internet Society ambassador do? That is definitely one of the questions I intend to post in the chat. And I want to invite you to post your questions as well over the next hour, as with Dr. Dhanaraj Thakur, we still scrolling and searching gender, technology, and power in the Caribbean.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dhanaraj Thakur, and today I want to talk about a very interesting topic, I think, which I've entitled, We're Still Scrolling and Searching Gender, Technology, and Power in the Caribbean. First, let me say that I am really excited and humbled to be invited by the Edna Manley College of the Visual and Performing Arts to give the 12th Annual Gender and Development Lecture. You should know that I was actually a part-time student at Edna Manley some 30 years ago. So yes, quite a while, but I feel like it's a good amount of time to return and to share some of my thoughts on a topic that I've been researching and thinking about for several years now, which is really the intersection of gender and technology and the policy implications of that. So although my background is in academia, and I still have done a lot of work with policy and with the media, and so I also know when it's appropriate not to use too much jargon, especially on top talking about issues around technology. So I'm going to try and do that throughout as well. So when we think about, the myriad number of different kinds of public policy problems that we face, and even going back to like the last century or so, we realize that technology has played a big role in addressing a lot of these problems, right? When you think about in agriculture and the development of different agricultural technologies, techniques, use of fertilizers and things like that, and the benefits that they've brought. When you think about the role of television and the whole entertainment industry that's built up around that, you also think about the many kinds of benefits that have accrued from that process. There are airlines and airline industries that has helped transportation, mobile phones for communication, and personal computers for education, productivity, and all these things, right? All of them are good. But when we dig a little deeper, we can see that some of these technologies have also, by being associated with particular systems, social and economic structures that are built around them, they have also brought with them negative effects. So in many ways, these technologies can be both good and bad. Think about it. When we think of agricultural technologies that have developed, in the last century or so, you think about large-scale farming and monocropping, isolating a farmland to a particular kind of crop and the kinds of negative environmental impacts that have stemmed from that. When you think about TVs, the entertainment industry, and the gender gap around that, some of you might be familiar with what's called a Bechdel test or variation of that, which is really a test to assess the extent to which, any two women in a story are talking about something other than a man in that story. And you'd be surprised to see how many popular TV shows and movies may actually fail that test. Let's look at airlines, and the airline industry. The reality is that women only make up 5% of pilots globally. So 95% on average, across the world in terms of pilots are men. And when you think of computers and mobile phones, and these are technologies I'm going to really zero in on in this talk. When you think about computers and mobile phones, there are actually significant design and use gaps between who is designing them and how people may benefit from them. So I think this is there are other ways of thinking about this problem, about balancing out the good and bad, and we should definitely consider these. And what I mean by that is that, yes, technologies can be good and bad, especially when you dig a little deeper below the surface. But maybe the real question to ask is around power. What impact do these kinds of technologies have on relationships of power and the distribution of power? We should ask, does the adoption and use of a technology actually change the distribution of power? And in what way, right? In other words, who has the most power? Who is making decisions, and who has the choices? Who does not have the choice? Who benefits financially or socially from a particular system or decision, right? It's also very important to look at benefits in an indirect way. So even if the person or a group is not involved in the decision making, is not making those decisions, they may benefit indirectly from those decisions, right? We can think about distribution of power in many ways, right? We can think of it in terms of race, income, if you think about it in race, we know that, for example, in Jamaica, people of European descent still hold a lot of power 182 years after emancipation, right? We know that Jamaica has high levels of income inequality, and what that means is that there are a few people with significant levels of income who have a disproportionate hold on wealth and power within the country, right? So there are many different ways to think of distribution of power. What I want to focus on, obviously, as I mentioned, and then you could infer from the title, is on gendered relationships. So what is the distribution of power with regard to men relative to women within society? And here I'm talking about gender in a very specific sense, in a binary sense, men and women, male and female. And a more sophisticated analysis, I admit, and I'll admit it from the very start, more sophisticated analysis would consider other forms of gender expressions and identities, right? Also bear in mind that a more comprehensive analysis would take an intersectional approach. We all take on multiple identities. We're not simply a man or a woman, but we're also, that also will intersect in terms of our race, income, age, disability status, and many other factors. So for purposes of simplicity, as you often hear in research, I'm trying to narrow the focus here on one specific dimension of power, and that's really around the gendered distribution of power. So yes, I am interested in technology and distributions of power, particularly with regard to gender. But a question that will come to mind is, what does technology have to do with gender anyway? And this is a key point that I want to reiterate throughout this presentation, which is really that technologies are not gender neutral. They're not neutral in any sense, in fact. They will embed the worldview, the biases, and just the thinking of their designers, right? To give you an illustration, I just want to step back away from the world of technology and draw on a book that's coming out soon, written by Nanjala Nyabola, a Kenyan scholar who does focus on tech policy issues, but actually wrote this book as a critique to existing travel guides. So often when you travel to different countries, you may pick up a guidebook, tells you where to go and what to see and who to talk to and what to eat and all of that. And her critique said, pointed out to the fact that a lot of these guidebooks are written by a particular set of people, often white people, written for white audiences, right? And what that means is if you don't fit into those categories, you might not benefit from some of the privileges that come with, that come from, stems from being white when you travel to many of these countries. And she gave the illustration of trying to find low-cost accommodations and how the authors, because they may be from a particular background and come with a particular privilege, did not have to worry about safety and security issues, whereas her as a Black woman traveling abroad in many of these countries would have to think about these things. So the question, really comes down to who is designing the product and who are they designing it for, right? Coming back to technology now, there's an interesting illustration of this problem in a book called Invisible Woman by Caroline Criado Perez, where she talks about the size of phones and how, in the design of a lot of phones that we use now today, the standard was often men. And the hand size, the threshold that was used in design of these phones was often that of men, which may be on average bigger than that of women. And that could partly lead to this problem of phones not fitting into the pockets of the pants that are worn by women, as you see in the picture here. That is also a function of design within the fashion industry, of course, which limits the functionality of a lot of clothes for women, but gives men a lot of functionality, particularly when they wear pants. So in effect, we really need to consider these questions here, because technology does have a lot to do with gender, and gender does have a lot to do with technology. And the key question I would ask and point it to, is who is actually doing the designing in phones in this case, and who are they designing for? So we know that technologies are not neutral, and they're often embedded with the biases of their designers. But a key point I want to make you aware of here when we're trying to connect, technologies and power in terms of gender is actually the context in which the technologies are adopted and used. That has a big role to play in understanding the potential impacts of technology on power and gender relationships. And the context that I want to use here as per illustration is that of Jamaica. And I want to draw your attention to some of the statistics here that I've mentioned to illustrate how power and the distribution of power in terms of gender is skewed in favor of men in the country. So for example, when we think of it in terms of economic power, women are more likely to be unemployed. And when they are employed in similar comparable jobs with men, they will earn a lot less than men for the same work. In terms of political power, women hold only around 28% of seats in parliament, and this may in fact be a historical high. In terms of the private sphere, there are significant levels of sexual violence meted out against women. And I should note on a side that that same statistic, reports of sexual violence per 100,000 persons, when you look at it, the countries, the top 10 countries in the world ranked in terms of the severity of that statistic, the Caribbean countries, several Caribbean countries are included in that top 10. But coming back to Jamaica, 27.8% of women reported experiencing intimate partner violence in a national survey that was conducted a few years ago. And whereas you may find different kinds of discrimination that impact on women's power and men's power, a lot of it is sometimes indirect and implicit. And this study on taxation that I'm referring to here, looked at the tax burden among different kinds of households in Jamaica and found out that female breadwinner households are subject to a higher incidence of total direct taxation than other types of households. And this is important because the tax code does not make any reference to gender. There's no distinction between men and women, right? Yet still, female-headed households still have a higher incidence of total direct taxation. And that's a function of the structure of the households. Often these kinds of households have more people in it, and also the kinds of income levels within those households. And what I also note is that even where we have put forward policies to address these different skewness in terms of distribution of power between men and women, whether it's economic, political, or within the private sphere, those policies can be undermined by patriarchal attitudes within the state, the government, and even wider society. And by patriarchal attitudes, I mean attitudes that give preference to men to hold and control more power in society relative to women. So this issue around context is important, and I just want to make sure that's part of how we would proceed in our analysis in terms of understanding the impacts of technology on power and on gender relationships. So we recognize that, as I mentioned earlier, technologies are not gender neutral, and the interaction with the context in which these technologies are adopted and used is also critical. And in the case of Jamaica, where there are prevailing patriarchal attitudes and where the distribution of power is skewed towards men, this becomes an important part of our analysis. So what I want to do then is look at two types of technologies. One is more current, and I think more people can relate to, which is around mobile phones, what I call information and communication technologies, right? Mobile phone, computers, and social media. And second, which may seem more far off, which is around artificial intelligence, but is actually already here and already part of our everyday use. So I want to look at those two sets of technologies as examples that we can proceed with our analysis. So when thinking about mobile phones and computers as a kinds of technologies that impact on power and gender, I want to draw on a study I did with some colleagues at UA a couple of years ago, which was published a few years after that, which really examined the impacts of these kinds of technologies on violence against women, right? And to be clear from the start, we have to recognize that one of the underlying reasons for violence against women is not just to perpetuate violence for that violence sake, but is really as a means of maintaining power and control. And so bear that in mind when we think about how these technologies relate to power and gender relationships. And there are many examples of how these kinds of technologies can be used in terms of violence against women. And there are a couple listed here on the slide in terms of sharing images and video without consent, stalking, abusing and harassing people online, threatening them, creating fake images and videos without someone's consent. So if you're, I know many of you follow the news and you will see headlines like these all the time. And these are actually pulled from both the Jamaica Observer and the Gleaner, pointing to examples of revenge porn and other kinds of violence against women that have involved the use of these technologies. In our study, which involved a national survey of adults in the country, we found that 20% of respondents said they had experienced some form of online gender-based abuse. But there's a significant gap here. Many women are more likely to report these kinds of abuse, and there's an age aspect to this as well. So, for example, young women, as in between 18 and 23 years, are 13 times more likely to be harassed online compared to men of the same age when you control for many other factors, right? And overall, 30% of women between 18 and 29 reported experience some kind of online harassment or abuse. Many of the referring to many of the examples I suggested earlier. So we can see from this study that there's a disproportionate impact on women. And when we spoke to many experts in this field, who are working to address the significant problem of violence against women in Jamaica, a lot of them suggest that the problem may be much worse for girls. So, in other words, under 18 years of age, and we do need a lot more research and interventions on this problem. The study also looked at offline impacts. And specifically in terms of relationships, abusive relationships. Here we spoke confidentially with women who were in these kinds of relationships, who were generous with their time and sharing some of their experiences with us. One of the things we point to based on those interviews is that these kinds of technologies, mobile phones and social media, are often used as a means of control by men in these relationships to monitor their partners' daily activities and to track who they spend time with, or sometimes they'll demand access to the woman's social media account so they can monitor what she's been doing and how people interact with her. This goes back to the point I mentioned earlier that violence against women is really a form of control and an expression of power. Going further, it can often exacerbate the problem. Several interviews also describe how their partners use the technologies to inflict further psychological and emotional harms, and that could involve sharing intimate photos or videos without their consent online, which has tremendous and very damaging impacts on someone's life. So in many ways, we need to really consider what kinds of disproportionate negative impacts from these technologies, mobile phones, computers, social media, and so on, can have on women and girls. And in fact, how it may be reinforcing, the attempts to undermine and the distribution of power between men and women, how it might privilege some men, particularly to maintain control of women, for example, in abusive relationships. The other scenario that I wanted to talk about is artificial intelligence and forms of discrimination as it relates to technology and gender. So AI is, essentially the study of devices that perceive their environment, understand what's happening around them, and define a course of action. But more practically, when we talk about AI, what we're really talking about is machine learning. And machine learning is essentially where machines learn how to complete a task without being explicitly programmed to do so, right? And to do that, these machines need a tremendous amount of data, essentially data that they can go through to spot patterns, and then they learn how to do things. So for example, if you want to teach a machine to be able to identify a cat, you might share lots and lots of pictures of different animals. And then the machine will eventually identify features of a cat, that correspond to what we describe as a cat, and eventually learn to know what a cat is. So in effect, what machines are really doing is making a prediction. So for example, I look through all the pictures of those animals and look at a particular picture and make a prediction or estimation as to whether or not this is a cat. And so this is a very simplistic explanation, but this is how a lot of machine learning works. And I'm going to show some examples of how this relates to the topic at hand, which is around gender and power. But before I get into that, I don't want you to dismiss this as being something far-fetched. This is really artificial intelligence, machine learning. It's really an everyday thing that we are already engaged with. So if you think about your phone, you know, and you often have an assistant on the phone, you say like, okay, Google or Siri or whatever, that technology is based on machine learning and AI. Or when you think of, like, for example, your social media feed, you know, on Facebook or Instagram or TikTok or whatever you use, and you see recommendations for different posts from different people or news to read or whatever, those recommendations are coming from an AI or machine learning based tool. So maybe some of you are familiar with Tesla, which is this electric car company, which includes, you know, tools where the cars actually learn how to improve their driving and help you to drive better. Those cars are actually all connected to each other. So as one car is learning how to drive better, it's actually sharing that knowledge, that learning with other cars. So all the cars are learning together at the same time. Or for example, when you look at your, you know, entertainment services online, like Netflix or maybe Spotify for music, and you get these recommendations for movies or songs, you know, that you might like. How does it know what you might like, right? This tool, the machine learning tool, is really, again, drawing on lots of data and making predictions of what you may or may not like, and making those recommendations to you. So the reality is AI is already here. We're already using it every day in our lives, even if we don't realize it. So when we think of AI and machine learning and gender and power, I want to bring your attention to certain forms of discrimination that follow from the use of AI, gender-based discrimination specifically. And some of these forms of discrimination are really explicit, and some are implicit. And I mentioned this kind of indirect impact that's earlier on, and I'll follow up with a few more examples of that. But let me start with the more explicit. And when I say explicit, I mean there's actually an intent, a clear intent to use these kinds of technologies, machine learning tools, to create harm on women, right? And one example of that is what's called deep fakes. Deep fakes are essentially using machine learning tools to create realistic but fake images, often sexualized images of women, and then that are shared online without their consent, right? So this has developed mostly around because of machine learning tools that have developed in the last few years, but they have become more widespread. And an example here is this headline that you see from reporting on the previous availability of a deepfake bot on Telegram. Telegram is a messaging app similar to WhatsApp, right? And how that tool was used to make fake images of girls. Most forms of discrimination in terms of the use of AI when it comes to gender relationships is often implicit. So there's no clear intent to create harm. Nevertheless, there's still potential harm, and that's the key point here, right? So when we think of AI assistant tools, right? And I mentioned some earlier, there is an issue here around how do we envision the identity of the AI tool? Often when we think of assistants, they are women. Women are considered assistants in this when the deployment of these tools are done, and we should ask ourselves why. Sometimes it actually takes on a very sexual nature, and I draw your attention to the screenshot, which is from a TV commercial for AI-based assistant tool for a phone developed by Micromax, an Indian phone company. And in the ad, this woman you see in the screenshot is actually meant to represent the AI, which is called Aisha. It's meant to represent the AI, and throughout the ad, it can be seen trying to seduce the owner of the mobile phone, the man there you see in the photo. But even where there's not, that kind of sexualized nature around the identity that's given to the AI assistant tool, there are other cases where, in general, that it's often just a woman's identity because it's it's an assistant. So there are examples of different kinds of chatbots that have been developed in Nigeria and Kenya, all with women's identities. And I think you might be more familiar with examples such as Siri and Cortana, Alexa, and OK Google, which all by default come with these women's voices and identities, right? So contrast that with IBM Watson, which is a powerful AI tool which has been used in public health, even to support doctors and to essentially help, in key decision-making systems. It's given a man's identity. So why is that? And this picture is a screenshot from the Jeopardy game show, which is a trivia TV show, and it competed with these top Jeopardy participants and actually beat the human participants. So just on a side, if Watson does take on a man's identity, then what we have here is essentially what I would call a male-only panel, and the popular term being manel, which is not something you still want to be seeing, particularly when we have discussions among experts nowadays, right? Okay, so we talked about information communication technologies like mobile phones and computers, social media, and how there can be these negative impacts on women, especially in women where where power relationships are critical, particularly in terms of like pushing violence against women even further and exacerbating existing problems. We talked about AI and how there could be different forms of discrimination against women that flow from that. But there are a couple other forms of discrimination and examples that I want to highlight here, which I think are important, right? I mentioned earlier when we're thinking about AI and machine learning, how these tools require tremendous amounts of data. Machine learning in particular. The problem is when the data sets that these machine learning tools are drawing on can be incomplete or flawed. And what kind of impacts might that have? And so there's this relatively famous study, Gender Shades, that zeroes in on this problem and looks at facial recognition systems, right? And points out that among some popular or I'll say well-known facial recognition systems by say Microsoft and IBM and others, there are actually relatively higher error rates for women with darker skin compared to other categories of people. In other words, these facial recognition systems, which are essentially trying to match, classify people's faces, was much better at identifying faces of white men compared to Black women. Now think about the implications of a system like that, where you see facial recognition systems being used in airports, in criminal justice and things like that. So there is a potential, because the data that's being used in these systems are flawed, and because of the designers themselves not being or being like limited to a particular group of people, may not recognize those flaws at the onset, there's a potential that the outcomes and the results may also be flawed. And then finally, another example that I want to point to here in terms of these kinds of implicit discrimination that stems from the use of AI is our own language. I mentioned earlier about chatbots. This is a tool that has been deployed in many different instances. But here we have the problem of not just, a reliance on the designers and their understanding of language. For example, it may just be mostly men, but also the context that the chatbots interact in, right? And the gender dynamics therein. Two examples here. One is from Microsoft's chatbot Tay that was developed several years ago, and which was eventually taken down because a while after it was launched, it started harassing women on Twitter. And then more recently, there's an example of a South Korean chatbot that was removed from Facebook because it started spewing hate speech against people. So where are we then? We know that technologies can be good and bad, but it would seem based on when we think about gender relationships, women more likely than men seem to be subject to some of these negative effects. Also, it would seem that a lot of these technologies do not change the distribution of power, but actually seem to reinforce a distribution of power that already favors men. And examples of that are from mobile phones and social media, as I mentioned earlier, being used as a means of control for women in abusive relationships. The sexualized nature and the association of women's identities with this AI assistant tools, but not the more sophisticated or what is perceived to be more sophisticated decision-making AI tools. The use of technology to carry out violence against women and other forms of discrimination against women, right? So what in effect we see here is technology exacerbating what is referred to within gender studies as the triple burden that women face: the burden of family, community, and work. And in all these different dimensions, technologies could be actually making those burdens worse relative to the benefits that accrue to men. So I mentioned a few examples here, right? And you might think of this as being limited, but bear in mind that many of these technologies are ubiquitous and are everywhere, right? And touch on almost all aspects of our lives. Machine learning tools, for example, are using many technologies, as I mentioned, which are not necessarily consumer facing, so you may not directly interact with them. One thing, though, to be aware of is that a lot of these machine learning tools, as I said over and over, they require tremendous amounts of data. Where is this data coming from? It's coming from us. We are the ones that are generating a lot of this data. You may have well heard over and over now that if a product is free online, then most likely it's just gathering and selling your data, and you are in fact the product, right? So these tools are here and they're everywhere, and we need to consider that fact, the potential for them to disproportionately and negatively impact women and support a distribution of power that favors men. It's not sufficient, obviously, to just lay out a problem. And I want to talk about how we can address some of these problems, at least as a starting point. I think, first of all, we need to acknowledge, as I've mentioned earlier, and hopefully shown you now, that technologies are not neutral. They're not gender neutral, nor are they objective in any sense. They are, in effect, a product of our society and all its biases, especially including those of the designers, right? So emerging technologies often co-evolve, right, with existing inequalities. They don't operate in a vacuum or separate from these kinds of inequalities, including gender inequalities, right? So they will, in effect, reinforce existing distributions of power and therefore patriarchal gender relationships, unless they're intentionally designed to do otherwise. And this point about intent is key. If we don't think of these, the deployment and design of these technologies as a means of addressing some of these problems in society, then, and without that intent, we are simply going to be replicating unequal distributions of power. So where can we start? I want to talk about things that policymakers could do, academics, researchers like myself, people in industry, all can do when it comes to addressing these kinds of impacts in terms of gender relationships and power that stem from technologies. So first, what about policymakers and governments? So I argue that what's really needed here are gender-responsive policy. Gender-responsive policies, broadly speaking, all policies should be gender-responsive, but particularly in this case, around technology policies. And what does that mean? Really, we have to be aiming to intentionally use and develop technology to support gender equity. So that means that we really need to address the issue around privileges that may accrue from technologies for those already in power, right? The design of these policies is also important. The process around is also important. So we need to look around the room and observe whose voices are being represented and make attempts to actually improve for more gender equitable decision making. Tied to that is, I just want to bring up a point I mentioned earlier around manels, which, you know, here we are in 2021, and we really should not be, participating in or seeing expert panels with around any kind of policy, public policy for that matter, but particularly around technology policy, which is just all men. That is clearly not going to be helping the situation. We need more data, obviously, for policymakers. And I say that because policy often involves, the collection of data, but what's critical here is that we have gender disaggregated data for all aspects of the policy design process, particularly around tech policy. And so that includes metrics around the tech industry generally and related sectors as well. And we really need to understand these different kinds of gender-based differences at each stage of the ecosystem, whether that is from the very beginning in terms of education at a very basic level, right? Kindergarten, primary school level around, science and maths and these kinds of disciplines, right up to product development. We need to understand where the gaps are and make interventions to address those gaps from a policy level. Governments also have a major role to play in developing guidelines to help industry address these kinds of gender discrimination and problems, gender inequality that occurs within their own firms, within their industry and sectors and so on. Often businesses, entrepreneurs and others don't have the time or resources to think about what these guidelines should look like. And so they may look to government for help. The government also has a significant role to play in terms of providing incentives to industry, for example, to hire more women and promote women's leadership in the technology sector, in terms of promoting different kinds of capital sources, but also incentivizing capital and venture capital, in fact, which is particularly relevant to Jamaica and the Caribbean, in terms of promoting gender equity in the tech industry. And then there are options around, financing and training, providing finance and training to support gender equitable technology entrepreneurship. This one around academia and research is particularly closer to me, given my kind of experience. And so I make some suggestions here. First of all, I think it's important to obviously applaud Jamaican and Caribbean-based computer scientists, engineers, entrepreneurs who are making significant advances in technology. You regularly hear about the development of new apps, new technologies, new ideas based on some of the tools that I've mentioned here, which may be even globally significant, right? My question is, where are the social scientists, the historians, the artists, the culture and gender studies scholars, and other kinds of researchers who may be better placed and better equipped to understand the kinds of disproportionate impacts that may follow from the use and development of these technologies, particularly from a gendered perspective? And I say this bluntly because engineers, computer scientists, and others are not trained to look at these or identify, analyze, and figure out how to mitigate these kinds of gender-based inequalities that stem from their tools and their industry. And so this is where we need to see others, particularly within the disciplines that I mentioned and elsewhere, to step up and look at address these problems. And that can come in the form of more data collection and analysis, particularly on gender, the use and adoption of gender technology, not just in industry, but in government as well. I think there's significant opportunities there, and that can help all of us better understand the scale of some of the problems that are mentioned here. And then we need to take this to a global level. We need Caribbean research expertise to address some of these big questions that many countries and many governments and many researchers everywhere and industries everywhere are thinking about. What are the kinds of ethical and legal frameworks we need to mitigate against gender-based discrimination from emerging technologies such as AI? These are difficult questions, but we need people from here, from the Caribbean, to be addressing them as well. This shouldn't just be a conversation that's happening outside of Jamaica and the Caribbean. And then when we think about industry, the IT sector and the various entrepreneurs and businesses that are developing these kinds of tools, what I would say as a start is that even if arguments around moral arguments and idealistic arguments around gender parity in the IT sector, in the mobile phone sector or other sectors is not appealing, I would point you to the fact that globally, companies that have at least have more than 30% of women in executive leadership positions are actually more profitable than those without. So having more women at different levels of leadership within a company can lead to greater profit. Should not necessarily be surprising, right? Because having more diverse thought can always, for example, lead to more use cases for your product and have better better adoption among users itself, right? Expanding the user base. And I mentioned examples around design earlier, for example, around phone size and some of the tools that we mentioned earlier as well. So having a more diverse base in terms of design, but also in leadership, can mean more money, which I think could be very useful for businesses. But more specifically at design level, one approach is something called discrimination conscious by design approach, which could be relevant here. And this is involved just asking the question, how does this product or service maintain gender inequality? Or how can it actually improve gender equality? So this goes back to the point about understanding the context and the kinds of gendered power relationships that exist within your market. And to better understand and address all these questions, we need more interdisciplinary teams. And that goes back to the call that I mentioned earlier among other kinds of disciplines, social scientists and others to enter and start asking these questions as well. I mentioned that machine learning tools need a lot of data. So there's an important point here about in terms of acquiring that data, that designers think about protecting people's privacy and also acquiring data through consent, through getting people's permission to actually use their data. So a lot of these recommendations have been more, outward looking, talking about what governments can do, industry, academics, researchers, but gender is also a personal issue. And the last point I really want to make here before concluding is really for us to look in the mirror. And I say this generally as a man. I also need to understand my privilege, whether that's in terms of gender, race, income, disability status, age, and all these things, and consider how we benefit indirectly or directly from technology systems, right? Who is designing them? How are they being used? And who benefits and who is being harmed? And where do I sit in all of that? Am I benefiting from this, or am I being harmed from this? Are we part of a system that disproportionately negatively impacts women when it comes to the use of technologies? These are questions that we should be asking as users and as individuals. And if we identify that, can we say and do something when we see these kinds of negative impacts? Because think about it, we're talking about half the country, half the population, half the world. If there are negative impacts, if there are injustices, then we are limiting the potential of half the world, half the country to, to really fulfill what they want to do in life, their dreams and ambitions. We're constraining them. And if we're constraining half the country, we're constraining the country as a whole. So at an individual level, I think there's a lot that we can do as well. And this is really about just reflecting, thinking about, how do we react to others in terms of gender? And especially when we use these kinds of technologies, often because it's not being done explicitly or on the surface. So when we are scrolling and searching online, I think we should ask questions like these, about the technology that we are using. We need to be proactive and creative in order to create a gender equitable society, and we really need to start today. So I want to thank you for listening. I really, again, I'm humbled and thankful and appreciative of the Dhanaraj College for inviting me to give this lecture. Thank you again. Take care. Goodbye.
I'm going back to Bob Marley. Some people got facts and claims. Some people got pride and shame. Some people got the plots and schemes. Some people got no aim, it seems. Well, we aim tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock in our coffee, tea, and you can't net me. Echoes of fire on cyberbullying. We aim to take your questions and to expand our discussion with our special presenter, Dr. Thakur. Do please join us on the Zoom link posted on your screen.